Hernandez tonight. We are going to be touching on a very sensitive, possibly difficult subject for many, many people, especially for those of us who grew up in church. Yes, this is one of those discussions and one of the desert nights where our focus is going to be on you, the church. Those of you that grew up in church, those of you that were raised in church, and even if you're not in church right now, but you have a lot of great memories of growing up, going to your parents' church, grandfather's church, wherever you attended. And we really want to talk to you. And you may ask why? Well, that's because there are many, many people who today are suffering because they grew up in possibly a broken home or an unhealthy home. And you may ask, well, what does that have to do with me, or how do you know? Well, we have seen an increase in the amount of couples that have decided to do something that maybe was unheard of growing up. Maybe something that we never thought would affect you or me or somebody in our family. And we have seen an increase in people in our own families, people that we know, people that we're connected to, people we grew up with, who are now single parents or who are now divorced, who have now created or started their own patterns of a broken family or an unhealthy family. So tonight, this is what we want to do. We want to talk to you about hope. We want to talk to you about how you can avoid it if possible. And if you're going through that now, or you're in it now, or you've already been through it, what can you do next? More importantly, what can the church do for you now? How does God play into all of this? If He is the creator of everything, and if God is the one that put you and your husband or wife together, when you look at Ephesians 5 and Genesis 1:27, it talks a lot about marriage and how we should treat each other. But what has happened to the family? What has happened, more importantly, to the Christian home? All you have to do is look at the news, look around at what's happening in this world. What are we missing? What is really missing in this world? A Christian family, a Christian dad, and a Christian mom. And our hope for you tonight, and what we'd like to help you with for a few moments, is just talking about this subject, just bringing this to the table. And I want to introduce some amazing people that are going to go on this journey with you. We're going to try to create a roadmap, and we want to be able to say, look, it's not impossible, especially with God, and especially if you have a good group of people around you. We are very excited to have with us from Fountain of Truth Church in Rancho Cucamonga, Myra Hernandez. Yay! Myra has a Master of Science in Counseling Psychology with a concentration in clinical counseling. She also is a social worker and associate marriage and family therapist. Myra, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Very happy to have my wife Celeste with us tonight, and Stephanie and Victor and Stephanie Castro, and Alonzo and Yolanda Canales. So welcome everybody. Excited to dive into this subject. So really want to start with this, and because all of us have grown up in church, we all have roots in our church, different organizations. So why do we think, why are we seeing more of it now? What do you think is the biggest difference from maybe when our parents were, when we were younger, as opposed to now? What do you think we're seeing? Why are we seeing it more now?
I think there was a lot of undercover broken homes.
Okay.
That's just my opinion, but I think there's a lot of undercover broken homes, and so now that it's not so taboo as it was back then to get divorced, those broken homes have carried into their children who are now married, who are now bringing that mess with them into their current marriages. And because it's not so taboo to get divorced, they're just like, I'm not going to do what my parents did.
Okay.
Move on.
Great. Anybody else? Why do you think we're seeing it so much now?
I see it as a vicious circle.
Okay.
I see it could be a generational stronghold that is within the family. Throughout the family tree, we see the consistent pattern of the father or the head of the household not staying committed in the relationship, and that falls down to the children and to the children's children, and it becomes a vicious cycle. I think we need more men to stand up against that. I feel We need more men to stand up and say, you know what, I'm going to break this generational curse. I'm not going to let it be a continuation on the branch of my family tree. And to be completely honest, I think we have a lot of young men right now who are just looking to be with as many women as possible. I feel
In the church.
in the church
the
as
church.
well. In the church as well, you know. Just because they're in the church doesn't mean that they're in church.
Right.
I think
You're going to preach, aren't you?
nah, I think these young men, and young men, if you're watching, I'm speaking to you, if you're old enough to have sex, you should be old enough to be a man of your household.
But to piggyback off of that, it's not just the young men, it's the young women who are in love with the idea of being in love. And so they're willing to sacrifice their morals and what they've been taught in church to follow the same pattern that their friends follow, to, you know, to fall into that same temptation, or just to follow the trend that's happening. Because nowadays, it's a trend to lose your virginity, at a young age. It's not a sanctified, you know, covenant that you make with God, where when we were younger, you know, it was a shame when you would hear that, and so it was always a shameful thing. Now it's all out in the open, and everything goes. So I think that's why it's more, you know, profound nowadays, because it's okay. Seeable, yeah, like it's not hidden, you know, anymore, because everything goes.
Celeste, why do you think we've been seeing it more nowadays? You and I had this discussion, a heated discussion, because we were trying to see where, you know, different angles, but why do you think we're seeing more of it today?
I think it has a lot to do with, like what Stephanie was saying, as far as back then you kind of hid it because there was shame in it. There was shame in separation and divorce. And now it just seems like the next generation's coming up and saying, no, I'm not going to live in misery. I'm not going to live unhappy. Hey, get divorced, get separated. It is what it is. I tried, didn't work out. See ya. But also to piggyback what the Canals was saying is sin is so rampant right now that what's right is wrong and what's wrong is right, and that's the society and the culture we live in. So now it's anything goes. Right. So I think back then, you know, in the church, it was, you know, you put a cap on it, you put a lid on it, you hide it, you put it under the carpet, and the next generation is coming up and saying, hey, you know what, let's see, nope, I ain't doing that, and they're out the door.
So let's ask Myra now. Myra, again, thank you for being here. You know, maybe you can help us with this. Why do you think that we are seeing more of this today, in today's world, in today's church? Why do you think this is just happening at a much quicker pace or rate than it was a long time ago?
It's very interesting because as I hear you guys speaking, I'm literally just going to give terminology, because what you guys are saying is what research is showing. So there's something called intergenerational transmission of divorce. And that means that when family, right, like my parents who went through a divorce, have done that, then now the children grow up in a broken home. So there's a couple things that happen with this type of intergenerational transmission of divorce. If you hear those words, that's heavy. You're transmitting this into the next generation, because I grow up in a home as a child who comes from a broken home, and I don't learn the appropriate coping strategies to deal with conflict, right? Because my parents are my models. And so if I'm in a home where my parents are consistently arguing, there's separation, whether anyone outside of my home knows it's happening or not, but it's happening within the doors of my home. And so I'm picking up on how to resolve conflict the way I see it at home. So I'm more likely, right, to then get into my marriage and follow the same resolution of conflict, whether it's negative or positive. There's another thing that was very interesting to see, is that we've really kind of chimed into this selfish generation where it's about me. So if I'm not fulfilled in my marriage, if my marriage is not satisfying me, if my partner is not fulfilling maybe an expectation that I had for a marriage, or a dream, or, you know, I came into a fantasy of a marriage, right? Not understanding what the reality of marriage is and the hard work that it takes to be married. Now I am more apt to say, it's not fulfilling me, it's not satisfying me, I can find somebody else who's gonna kind of do that. And it's okay now, because you see celebrities, social media, there's this idea of don't judge me, because then I'm going to get offended, and then I'm not going to go to your church anymore. I'm going to go somewhere else. And so there's this idea of I have to kind of take care of me, when in reality, marriage is if I take care of my spouse and he's taking care of me, we're both taken care of. I'm not taking care of myself. And that's something that we need to change. That's a perspective that needs to be changed. So I do agree that I think it's always been there. It's always been an issue. But now we can see it and we know it's happening.
Right. That's a very good point. And one of the things that has, come into our mind in preparation, we've talked a lot about this, and we have looked at this from many different angles, right? But the one thing that kind of has stuck with me, Myra, in all of this is, like you said, it's not 100%. No marriage is 100% perfect. Obviously, there's no church or denomination or people that will never get divorced. It's gonna happen, right? But in the church, in our background, in what we live in, what we believe, do you think or do you feel that it's more prevalent now in the church because there's possibly more sin, or is it just the generation and the world that we live in?
I definitely think it's probably a combination of both, because we look at the world that we live in, right? And more and more laws are changing to aid liberality. We want to be liberal. We want to allow certain things to happen. You look at the rate of abortion, right? You look at homosexuality. There's so many things that as a society we've said these things are okay, and with that comes growth of sin, because now it's permissible. So I don't have any guilt. Like, you asked the question earlier of, how did it affect you? Well, back then we were in a church of maybe 50, 60 members. It was such a close-knit church. And you knew all of the families. And so when all of a sudden now you see a mom coming with all of her children and the man's not showing up, it starts throwing up questions of, where's your dad? Right. But now there isn't that accountability. And if your close-knit circle kind of is not there to be there for you and to support you, the rest of the people, there's no understanding of what's really happening. And so I would say it's a combination of both. Yes, there's a rise in sin, but also there's this idea of, if it happens, it happens. And as a church, can we really set certain boundaries and regulations without the fear of losing our members somewhere else?
Good
so
point.
I had a really quick question. I had a friend many, many years ago. It was a good friend of mine, and I remember he was about to get married. I said, "Oh, but you're not in love with her. Look at, you're not," because I had the Disney idea of marriage, right? And so I remember he told me, he said, marriage isn't about love, it's about commitment. And I said, what? That is so sacrilegious. Like, who says that, And so what is your take on that? Because I feel that that's a lot also a generational thing, because if we notice a lot of young kids that come to our workplace, they can't get something, they don't get a raise in 6 months, they're quitting. Oh, yeah. They move to something else, they're quitting, and so there's a lack of commitment. And so do you feel that plays a lot also into the love versus commitment, and how much of a commitment also is involved in marriage, right?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely want to think about value and worth, right? Like, how do we value our marriage? Is our marriage something that we're willing to fight for? And is our marriage our priority? Because very interesting, and I was talking to Sam and Celeste about this on the phone as we were preparing, because they said divorce and my mind went 1,000 different ways. And I was thinking about the satisfaction in marriage, right? So you get married and you have high satisfaction in your marriage. I'm talking about in every possible way. You're in a honeymoon stage, you're enjoying each other, you're getting to know each other. And as I'm saying this, I see all of you guys smiling, because you're probably thinking about, how was it back then, right? Like when we first, we would hold hands, we would stay on the phone. And then the majority of couples either start going through situations in their marriage, because all of us are going to go through situations in our marriage that are going to put us to the test of this commitment, right? Or you have children. And so what happens is the satisfaction in your marriage goes way down during that time, because your focus as a parent is to ensure that your children are growing up safe. And the majority of couples during that time of child rearing, they disconnect completely. There is no intimate time. There is no alone time. The children are in their bedrooms and they're sleeping on their beds every night. And I'm too exhausted to even go out to dinner with my spouse by myself or have a conversation. So now what happens is children leave, they go to college, and you have two options. Either your marriage, you rekindle and you gain this high satisfaction again in your marriage at that time, or your marriage doesn't survive. And what happened before is that we had a lot of marriages that would say, I don't love this person, but I made a covenant, I made a pact, right? And so whether I love them or not, I'm here for life until I die. It doesn't matter if we're unhappy, it doesn't matter if we're arguing every day, but I'm here for life. This is what I said. Now our marriages are saying, I'm living with a total stranger. I don't know you, and this is not good enough for me. And you have marriages, people that have been married 20, 30 years that are calling it quits. Wow. You know, so there's this idea of satisfaction in your marriage. Is it important? Yes, because you could live a committed marriage, although now commitment is very difficult for this generation because there's so many options. But you can live a committed relationship and live unhappy for the rest of your life. So you have to put some time into your marriage. I encourage my siblings, I've done this since we got married. I learned this from a professor of mine. Once a year, go out on your own and take inventory of your marriage. Once a year. That's something that it cannot not happen. So it's either one night or 2 nights alone. Find yourself a babysitter for that time and go and take inventory of your marriage. How are we doing? You know, are we doing okay? Are there things that we need to fix? Are there things that we need to change? Because you can have those conversations intimately away from your children, and then you as an individual set goals for yourself. You can say, I heard my spouse's feedback, and I'm gonna set this goal for myself, a realistic goal, right? To say, I need to start making this change because this is important to my spouse. But hardly any couples take the time to do that.
Wow, this is really, really, really insightful. Either we have or we know someone that's come from a broken home, right? Or an unhealthy home. We've come from divorce. We've seen it. We know people that have been affected by it. You know, how do we prevent it? If you come from it, or, you know, if someone approaches you and says, this is what I'm going through, or this is what my parents went through, you know, what do we say? How do we help our brothers and sisters in church to prevent them from doing what maybe their parents did? What have you guys seen? I mean, what do we do in that case?
So I married a beautiful lady that came from a broken home, and I came from a home that was picture perfect. My mom and my dad, they never argued. At least they never argued in front of me.
That's a big difference.
Yeah, they never. The way they raised us also was very passive. It was very instructive, very disciplined, but without aggression, without any of that bad stuff that you see nowadays. But coming into a marriage in which she was coming from a broken home was difficult for me because I missed so many clues that she was just throwing out there, but not really communicating that with me, and I missed all of that. I blamed her for so many years for not being straightforward with me, with the things that she dealt with, and all these shadows and demons that she demons, if you want to call it, but all these difficulties that she dealt with, and I failed to listen, and I also failed to ask. I never asked, how do you feel? How was it? I never cared, or I never wanted to ask those questions because I really didn't want to know. And that was the thing with her. I just did not want to know because it never affected me. So to me, I think that's a big thing for couples, is to ask those questions and to listen, to listen to their spouse, because I think if I would have done that, if I would have taken the time and that, just that moment, just to listen to my wife and express what she felt, we would have done things completely different. So that to me.
So I'm curious, did you give him signs, or were you trying to tell him by not how, or did he just not get it at all?
I think a lot of times when people come from broken homes, they will say things, that kind of indicate, hey, my father was abusive, or my parents were divorced, or But the spouse
But
really,
we don't understand it.
but this, a lot of times the spouses don't understand that. They don't understand how much that affects, really affects that person. So what happens in marriage, like, well, with me, I can only speak for myself, is that you become, as a woman, you become vulnerable. You all of a sudden, you're leaving this broken home, you finally commit yourself to somebody, but then there's a vulnerability that happens. It's like something, you all of a sudden are putting the trust that you had broken from the trust from your family, you're now putting all that trust in your spouse. And so when you feel that spouse has broken that trust, the vulnerability and the brokenness that happens it just opens wide up. And then, so everything that I held in, because for me, I'm an internal person. I think we talked about that in Desert Nights. I'm an internal person. All of a sudden, it was like the cap was broken off. Like, everything that I felt, like all the anger or stuff that I internalized with my family growing up, I all of a sudden just, it's like a steaming pot, just, it was just, and that's what happened. And that's what happened with us.
Oh, yeah.
And so for me, I thought like, hey, if he doesn't get this, like, what else do I need to do? Hang a banner? And he's like, I don't understand it because I don't understand that type of life that you came from.
I didn't experience that. And to her, what you're saying is that pretty much she translated all this anger and all this suffering and all this, things that she dealt with when she was growing up into our lives, into our marriage. She literally transferred it. And I didn't know how to deal with it because I never experienced that. So inexperienced, young, in love, and I expected for marriage to be, our first year was like the toughest.
Yeah.
I say, and a lot of people think that the first year is like the honeymoon. No, for us was the
Really?
toughest.
Wow.
So I do have a question for Myra about that because, there are people that come from broken homes where there was divorce and they make it. You're okay. You get through it, like Stephanie and Victor are talking about. But there are many where they don't. Why do you think that is?
It has a lot to do with intentionality, right? When we're talking about marriage, and I think right now we're learning that all of us that come from a broken home, we have this intergenerational transmission of divorce already there. So it puts us at a higher risk of divorce. That's just the truth. Because we saw divorce as an option. So while a marriage, like maybe for you, I don't know if that's the case, but your parents did well, they were a healthy marriage. So for you, divorce is like, that's not even an option because it wasn't an option in my home. However, for us that have gone through a broken home, divorce is an option because it's happened in my family. And so the difference between couples that make it and couples that don't is that couples become intentional. And I love the example that they're giving because something clicked, right, for you. And you said, I'm not asking, and she's not communicating, and we need to figure this out. And it was a whole year of maybe failing and making mistakes, but at some point you said, we need to change this because this is not going well. And so there has to be that level of intentionality. And for us that come from a broken home is knowing those shortcomings, accepting the shortcomings. That's vulnerable because I don't want to accept to somebody else that I'm coming with baggage. I'm coming with issues. I'm coming with insecurities. For me, it wasn't just a divorce. It was a mother who was addicted to substances, a mother who was involved in infidelity. And me as the oldest daughter, I saw the infidelity happening within the walls of my home. And I felt like I couldn't tell my father because I was going to be the reason for breaking up the marriage. So I consistently would, on purpose, not bring out a longer skirt for her or try to kind of get my dad's attention to say, look at what's happening in your home, because I didn't want the one to say something is changing in my mother. And then on top of that, abandonment, because mom decided when I was 11 that she wanted to leave. And so all of these things, I came with a tornado of issues, and it took me 4 years to allow my husband to say, now let's get married, because I was not ready for marriage. I was dealing with so much trauma and so much baggage. I couldn't be a wife. And so having the ability to sit down as an individual and say, this is what I'm bringing into my marriage, where do we start? And that's why premarital counseling is a must in a church. If you don't have premarital counseling with a pastor who either has years and years of experience or has some type of background in counseling that can sit down and do some type of an assessment with you and say, this is where you're going to have difficulties, this is where you're going to have difficulties, you guys need to figure this out right now before getting into a marriage, you are far more susceptible to bringing damage into the marriage.
Thank you for visiting us at FTC Phoenix. This is where God transforms your pain into
His purpose.